Hello, everyone. My name is Joanna Lee, a fourth-year doctoral student at Kelly School of Business, Indiana University. Today, we are very honored to have Ryann Manning here, the winner of the 2022 Louis Pondy Best Dissertation Paper Award. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this award, it recognizes the best paper based on a dissertation and is issued once a year. So this year, the award is presented to Ryann for her paper, Constructing Proximity for Distance Moral Action During the Ebola Outbreak. Ryann, congratulations for winning this award. We are very excited to have you here, and we look forward to hearing the story behind this paper. So first of all, could you please tell us a bit about yourself and what this paper is about?
Thank you, Joanna. I am currently an assistant professor at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. My PhD was in organizational behavior and sociology from Harvard. This paper, which draws on my dissertation, looks at how people who are located far away from a place in crisis organize to provide help. So I use qualitative methods to examine a case study of distant helpers. Specifically, I look at members of Sierra Leone's diaspora community. So these are people with a connection to the country of Sierra Leone who live elsewhere in the world. And they organize to help respond to the country's Ebola outbreak in 2014 and 2015. And so in the paper, I find that members of the diaspora created and leveraged three forms of proximity: moral proximity, narrative proximity, and physical proximity, which help motivate and shape the actions that they took to help, enabling them to provide help even though they were located at a distance from the place in crisis.
Thanks for sharing. So this is a really cool paper. Can you share with us how does your dissertation take shape? So for example, why did you choose to focus on this topic?
So I had actually planned an entirely different dissertation and had started collecting some preliminary data and was writing a prospectus. The Ebola outbreak hit Sierra Leone, and I had lived in Sierra Leone for almost 5 years before starting my PhD, and I'd worked there in the healthcare setting, and I'd continued to do research there with nurses. And so when the outbreak hit, it was really devastating and really it was a very uncertain and difficult time for people in Sierra Leone, and also for people like me who cared about Sierra Leone. And so I felt compelled to do something to help. I ended up taking a short leave of absence from my PhD so that I could play a small role, stepping into a leadership role with an organization that was working on the ground in Sierra Leone. And at the same time, I started to think about whether and how I might pursue research related to the outbreak, because when I came back from my leave, I was going to have to do a dissertation, and I tried to figure out, was there a way that I could connect, this important phenomenon that was happening that I was really spending a lot of time working on and thinking about with my dissertation research. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that and getting lots of advice. And I was really concerned about sort of ethically how to do research during an acute crisis of this sort. So in particular, as I mentioned, I had worked with nurses who were on the front lines of responding to the Ebola outbreak. But I was really concerned about data collection that might add to the burden of people who were really on the front lines of such an acute crisis and were dealing with a lot. And so I sort of grappled with a number of different possibilities, trying to figure out whether there was something I could do that would be interesting and informative from a research perspective, but not burdensome to those in Sierra Leone. And so eventually I ended up got really interested in the role of the diaspora. So this was something I had watched unfold. These were organizations that I saw in real time, forming and trying to respond to the outbreak. Ordinary, most of them volunteer-led, a lot of emergent organizing, and in response to the crisis. And so I decided to focus my dissertation on that effort, so on members of the diaspora responding. And so that enabled me to collect real-time data without burdening respondents, because I could collect data from online conversations that were taking place. Because this was a distributed virtual form of organizing, a lot of the really important work was happening online in virtual spaces that I could observe without adding to the burden of those who were working on the response, and also without creating any sort of risk for them, in terms of disease transmission. So it was an opportunity to observe what was going on in real time. I also gained access to several of the organizations who shared with me real-time data about their response. So they shared internal data like emails and reports and information that they had, that sort of documented their response in real time, as well as some external, documents and materials that they had produced. And then I combined that with retrospective data. So I also conducted a number of interviews and did some observations after the fact, after the outbreak was over, with members of this diaspora response.
Thanks, Ryan. So we see that your paper is deeply embedded in a very unique context, which may be related to your previous experience outside of academia. So could you share with us about that a little bit? And relatedly, what type of advice would you give to scholars with past non-academic experience? How would that help with their research?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's a really important question, and one that I sort of grappled with during my PhD and with classmates and colleagues who also had industry experience of various sorts. And I think it's a great question. So, my experience deeply shaped my dissertation. These were questions that I would not have asked if I hadn't lived and worked in Sierra Leone and been familiar with the context, and especially, had some familiarity with the diaspora's response. So I think it informed the questions I asked. It informed that access. It really helped facilitate access. So I was able to approach organizations and individuals with the benefit of that, experience. And some were people who I might have known through my networks, but many were people I didn't know, but I was able to say, to share with them my experience, my expertise, such as it was, and that helped facilitate access. So I do think having industry experience, can be a real asset in that way. I think it helps inform questions in the sense of knowing what questions would be important and useful. Like, what questions is that industry grappling with? What are practitioners trying to figure out? What are the important puzzles? And so, for someone who can sit at the intersection of academic literature, that we study in our PhDs and ongoing in our academic careers, and also have some familiarity of what's going on in the field of interest, I think is really valuable. And so my advice is that people who have that experience, don't be afraid to draw on it. I think sometimes we can be afraid to study organizations that are familiar to us, or fields or industries that are familiar to us. But I actually think there are great ways to do it responsibly, and that it can be a really great, as I said, a really great asset. Of course, you do need to be reflexive about how your position as a sort of insider, outsider, or your past experience might influence the research. So you want to make sure that it doesn't mean that you have any blinders or preconceptions, and that you're able to approach the research with an open mind. I think there's a lot of great methodological resources depending on your methodology for how to make sure you do that, how to make sure you maintain sufficient distance and critical reflexivity to make sure that you're doing the research in a rigorous and responsible way. But if you build that into your process, I think it can be a really great opportunity to combine the past experience that you have with what you've gained during your PhD.
Thanks, Ryan. That's actually closely related to what I'm going to ask next. So based on your experience of doing a dissertation and winning this award later on, what advice would you give to doctoral students who are currently picking their dissertation topics?
So it's such a hard question, and I can't solve that. I can't tell everybody what their topic should be. I think it's an important question. So here's just a few tips. And I guess in general, I would say any advice that you get, like, this is all from my experience, which is an N of 1 of doing one dissertation. So, take that as it will. But, I think one is to make sure that whatever the topic you choose is something that you really love and are excited about, at least at the beginning. So a dissertation is a long path. And, my dissertation has been done for several years, and I'm still working on these papers coming out of the dissertation. So this is going to be a very long journey. And so, there will be times where you hate your topic. And so at least make sure that you're excited about it when you start. And I think that's easy to say, but it can sometimes be hard to know whether something's the right topic. But I guess I would say sort of trust your gut on that. And I also think it's a related point, but to make sure that it's something that that the student is really excited about, not necessarily something that your advisor is really excited about, or that your other classmates or colleagues are excited about. Like, you're the one who has to do the dissertation, and so it has to be something that you think is worth pursuing, which isn't to say not to get advice and to take that advice on board, but certainly pursuing a dissertation that someone else told you to do, I think, can be a recipe for disaster. And then I think it can be really hard. I would say I would caution against trying to predict what's going to be sort of hot or impactful, at least from a theory perspective or a academic perspective, because these things change, and even the world changes. So I think my research on responding to an Ebola outbreak has ended up, very sadly, being much more relevant to our present lives than I think I anticipated when I was doing it back in 2015. I thought it would be sort of a niche topic, but it turns out we're all living through a pandemic. So I just think, you don't know how and in what ways your research is going to be impactful. And so, you want to try to figure out something that you really feel is worth pursuing. It's an important question to you. And relatedly, I would encourage everybody, especially maybe those who don't have industry experience, but even those who do, who have been out of the field for a few years, to talk to practitioners in the field and really try to find out whether this question is a question worth asking, right? So, if you're doing qualitative work, I think there are opportunities to do preliminary interviews or talk to people in an organization before you actually commit to a line of inquiry and before you write a prospectus, to try to pressure test your ideas and get a sense of, here's what I'm thinking of pursuing, here's the kind of data I'm hoping to collect, here are the kinds of questions I think would be worth asking. Are these questions that people in the field are interested in, or is it something where when you actually go to talk to them, or when you find the answer, they're just going to say, yeah, we've known that, that was a question we were asking 10 years ago. So I think it is valuable to talk to people in the field. And if you can't do that, I think there are ways to kind of absorb or insert yourself into the social world of the people you're hoping to study or the organizations you're hoping to study in advance of doing the research. It can be as simple as, for one of my new projects, I started by just following a whole bunch of new people on Twitter who are from a very different organizational setting and field that I wasn't familiar with before. And it was a way to start to get a sense of what kinds of conversations they were having, and what kinds of what kinds of conversations were going on, what kinds of resources were they reading, what were the industry publications that they were reading and talking about that I should be reading. So, I think there are creative ways where you can kind of start to get a sense of what's going on out there in the real world, and that doing that in parallel with developing your ideas for a dissertation can be really valuable.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for sharing these very insightful opinions. So next, I would like to ask you, can you share with us what challenges have you faced in the process of doing your dissertation? And also for doctoral students who are currently working on their dissertation, are there any advice or tips you would give them?
Yeah, so so many challenges. I don't think I even want to recount them all. This was a hard dissertation to write in many ways, because it is a really it's a topic that is close to my heart, but it was also a really difficult time and a lot of difficult conversations. So I felt privileged to be able to study it and to talk to the activists that I spoke with and those who I interviewed, but certainly it was hard in many ways. But I actually think every dissertation is hard. They're just hard in different ways. And I think figuring out how to work through those challenges is actually in some ways the most important part of doing a dissertation. I think it's often said that the best dissertation is a done dissertation. So I do think thinking about your dissertation as the start of a research career rather than the pinnacle of everything that you'll do is really valuable, and focusing on developing a dissertation, completing it, writing it, submitting it, not letting these challenges derail you, I think is really important, and just that's the crux of it. And it won't be perfect, and that's okay. I think relatedly, I guess I would say my sort of, in some ways, personal advice, but definitely advice that I give to graduate students all the time, is that dissertations can be lonely. This might be the first time that you've done an independent research project where you're really sitting yourself in front of a computer for so many hours and days. And I mean, that has always been true. I'm sure that is even more true now with the disruptions of COVID. I met some of my PhD colleagues, and I had sort of classmate friends from my program would joke that their dissertation was good preparation for the isolation of COVID, because we did spend so many months sort of not talking to other people and just trying to write. But I think finding ways to make the dissertation less lonely and making sure that you have the social support as well as peer advice and input can be incredibly important. So find a writing group, meet with your PhD classmates at your institution or elsewhere. I mean, we had a group that met, I don't know, every month or something, and we were writing on completely different topics, but we could set goals, keep each other accountable, read snippets of things we were writing. And I think it was really essential to sort of moving the project forward at times where you're not necessarily going to go to your advisor with every question or every draft, but you might benefit from having peers to talk to.
Thanks. I definitely agree that having some intellectual as well as social emotional support is very important. So next, I would like to switch a little bit. So can you share with us, how does your dissertation shape your research trajectory, in particular after you become an assistant professor? Because looking into your CV, it seems that you have been doing a lot of research in this field, in the specific context. So would you like to share something with us about that?
So that's a great question, and continue to evolve to my research interest. I'd say continue to evolve in ways that I wouldn't necessarily have anticipated. So certainly I can say that in the most concrete way, my dissertation, which, you know, sort of in some ways stemmed most directly from my connection to the place of Sierra Leone and a place that I had worked and my work in the healthcare setting there. But then because of my dissertation, I got really interested in these forms of virtual organizing, and especially emergent forms of organizing. And so I now have a stream of research looking at how ordinary people do extraordinary things during times of crisis, including by, you know, sort of organizing in these emergent ways in the response to an acute crisis. And so I'm currently working on a new project, for example, that looks at organizing starting in 2021 in response to the crisis in Afghanistan. So as the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, there was this massive effort around the world to try to help people who were trying to leave the country. And so this is, again, a case similar in some ways to the case of diaspora organizing, but also very different, of people, ordinary people in their basements, in their kitchens, in their living rooms, trying through virtual spaces to organize with other volunteers to do what they can to help. And so, you know, that is not something that when I was a PhD student, I would have said, this is what I'm going to go study for the next, you know, decade or so of my career. But that's ended up being a real interest of mine. And so, and I'm grateful to the dissertation, you know, in some ways leading me in that direction, in a direction I wouldn't have expected. So it's been really interesting.
So my next question would be a bit more general. So can you give some advice to young scholars who are interested in pursuing phenomenon-based research? Based on your research expertise and experience, we see that a lot of your research is qualitative, phenomenon-based, and very interesting and intriguing. So can you share something with them?
So I love this kind of research. I love the qualitative research. I love being able to, you know, the opportunity to sort of enter a world that I wasn't a part of beforehand, to speak with people about their experiences, to observe them at work, is such a privilege. And the data collection part of qualitative research brings me so much joy. It's really hard. It's often exhausting, it can be emotional, but it is absolutely my favorite part of this work. And I feel really privileged for having done that, I think, or for being able to do that. I think, so I absolutely encourage anyone interested in doing qualitative work, you know, to pursuing that. I think that one of the biggest challenges and a caution is just that the research, first of all, it takes a really long time. So all research takes a really long time, but I think qualitative work often has this very long tail. So you don't necessarily even know what you're studying until, maybe years later, right? Because the data analysis and the writing are part of the research, and you're still trying to figure out, what is this a case of? What is my theoretical contribution? What are my findings? And I think that has a very different feel than other forms of research where you do a lot of that work up front. And, if you're doing experimental work, you've done a lot of that theorizing in advance of designing the experiment. And by the time you collect data, I think you have a very clear sense of what you're trying to study. At least this is my sense. I don't do experimental work, but that's my sense. Is I think it's a real different kind of rhythm of research. And so I think just to be prepared if you're pursuing a phenomenon-based, abductive, qualitative piece of work, is that you really don't know where that journey is going to take you. And that's exciting, but it's also can be kind of scary. And it can sometimes feel like you're not making progress, even though you are. My favorite metaphor for qualitative work, but I actually think it helps, I think it applies to a lot of research, but it resonates with me, is thinking about research as a parking garage. So this is not at all I take no credit for this, but I also have no idea who to give credit to. So if anyone out there knows the source of this metaphor, I would love to know. But if you think about a parking garage where you have to drive in a circle to go up levels. So you enter the parking garage on the bottom and you have to drive up a ramp, and it feels every time like you're going around in a circle. You feel like you keep seeing the same spot over and over again, but in fact you are making progress. So you're moving upwards through the parking garage, but it doesn't feel that way along the way. It feels like you're going in circles. And I think that qualitative work can often feel like you're going in circles. And maybe that's true of all kinds of research to a different extent. But just to remember and believe that you are making progress and that you're getting somewhere different than where you started.
It's a great metaphor. And I would like to ask, what roles do your colleagues, your advisor, and your peers play in helping develop this paper? And would you give any suggestions for doctoral students or for junior scholars who are seeking to get their dissertation published?
It's a good question. I mean, I was blessed with wonderful advisors who both gave me the space to pursue research and to sort of trust my own instinct about what I wanted to do, but also were always there to, give me feedback, to pressure test my ideas, to challenge me when I was off base. So I definitely think finding good supportive advisors, but advisors who are supportive but also willing to push back, I think is really important. And that's true of any PhD student. I think qualitative work it's often sort of learned through the doing of it. There's a lot you can read about the methodology, but it can be very helpful to work closely with people who do qualitative work and to see how they approach their own data. So whether it's co-authoring with colleagues before you start your dissertation, or co-authoring with more senior faculty or more senior graduate students. We had a great kind of peer group for learning qualitative research, led by senior faculty, but also gave us a chance, many doctoral students, to share our own work in progress and learn from one another. So, I do think there's a kind of learning through doing in qualitative research. And so finding opportunities to I definitely feel like I just benefited a lot from sharing this work when it was messy and early stage, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I was sharing memos or, snippets of data that were partially analyzed, and initial ideas about what it might be going on, and getting feedback from lots of people during that process. That was a huge benefit to me in shaping the paper and the dissertation. And so, yeah, it's very much a collective effort, and I'm grateful for all of that input.
Thank you. I guess just one last question. So can you give some advice on writing for junior scholars? Because your writing is really precise and clear, and I find reading your paper is an enjoy. So can you share something about that with us? How do you improve your writing skills?
really important skill. I feel like I'm still figuring that out. So I think the things that have been the most helpful for me are finding exemplar papers. So as you're reading papers, you can start this in your first year of the doctoral program, reading papers that you really love, not necessarily because of the findings or the theory being related to what you're interested in, but just that you like the way they're structured, you like the way they read, you think they're well written. And then referring back to those exemplar papers specifically for the kind of research you're doing and the journals you're targeting. So I always have 1 or 2 papers when I'm writing for a particular journal from that journal that also use qualitative methods, and that I really, I think their structure works well for what I'm trying to do. And I model my paper on those papers. And I, really try to sort of learn from the underlying structure of what they've done. So of course not, replicating the language of what they're doing. And sometimes what they've done is a completely different topic. So in some ways it's even more helpful when the topic is unrelated to yours. But I learned one of the things we were taught to do in our PhD program was to create a post hoc outline of a published paper. So to take a paper that someone else wrote and published and create an outline after the fact. And then so that allows you to see how the paper was structured. And so I think for me, I still do that now. I outline other people's papers, and then I outline my paper to figure out how did they present their findings in the constraints of a particular journal and the style of a particular journal, because they do all vary. And yeah, it can be hard with qualitative work to fit so much into a small space, but learning from others who have done it successfully, I think is really helpful.
Thanks for the tips on writing. I find them really useful, and they are all very practical guidance. So I'll definitely put them into practice in the future. Okay, I guess that's everything I'd like to ask today. Thank you again, Ryann, for spending the time with me and for sharing your experience and insights. I wish you a very successful and fruitful new school year, and I hope to continue the conversation with you in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you for your thoughtful questions.